You are listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we are remembering Star Wars. Here we go. You are listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. And Pete, since you've talked about how Star Wars it made such a big influence on you when you were growing up, movies that we talked about on other episodes, you did see Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin, and Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, two movies that had to have also been influenced by Star Wars. You saw those in theaters, but did you see Star Wars: A New Hope or any of the sequels in the theater?
Oh, sure. I think I've talked about this, but I was in my pajamas at the Smith Haven Drive-In in the summer of 1977 to see the original Star Wars.
Wow.
Lost my almost 5-year-old mind as I was on the playground at the drive-in, and once, back then before the movie was starting, they do a little flash of the lights on the playground to let you know that the movie was about to start. And I was in, I had like the plastic footy pajamas. And once the lights started flashing, I started screaming at my parents, like, we gotta get to the car. And, running across the gravel lot to get to our family station wagon was, might be the fastest that I've ever run.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Here they come. Coming in too fast.
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe. It's a big, sprawling space saga of rebellion and romance. It's a spectacle, light years ahead of its time.
I am C-3PO, human cyborg relations, and this is my counterpart, R2-D2.
Hello.
It's an epic of heroes.
Good luck.
And villains. And aliens from 1,000 worlds. Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
I somehow, the hype had hit me, and I knew that this was something that I had to see. And like many people, changed, the trajectory of my young life and my creative life, I would say, for sure. So, saw all the original trilogy in the theater. I think I've seen every Star Wars movie in the theater. Yeah. I'm always down for a Star Wars ripoff. I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing to crib from something that inspired so many people. So I talked about Space Hunter and Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin. While I think certainly Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin left me wanting at the end.
There was no destruction. There was no destruction.
They scratched an itch for my 10, 12-year-old self at the time. But, and I mentioned this on a previous podcast as well, I didn't go home and start to play any of those movies. It was always friends would come over, we'd go into the woods across the street, or we'd find some lot of woods in our neighborhood, and we'd be playing Star Wars. It was always Star Wars. None of the other ones were able to break through that dome because they just were inferior.
Star Wars. It is more than just a successful movie. It is a box office phenomenon. The film is breaking attendance records all over the country. Not since Jaws have so many people stood in line to see a movie. Alan Ladd Jr., an executive at 20th Century Fox, whose film it is, talked about the reasons for its appeal.
I think it's just good and evil. The simplicity of the whole story is what really makes it work. It's a fantasy, and I think we all grew up in a fantasy world, and I think that it works on that level.
Yeah, just a completely different world and different generation of hype building up to it.
I think when you said hype, that's the word that is kind of hard to almost comprehend now. New Hope is 77. And when these movies came out, the ripples that they had, I think, in pop culture, it's hard to look at it now. You almost have to watch YouTube footage of kids and adults walking out of theaters, and you see that expression of exuberance, excitement. Like you said, their minds have been blown because they'd never seen anything like this before.
Everything was fantastic. Whoever wrote it had a fantastic imagination.
I think it was good.
Just good?
No, fantastic. It was exciting, but I didn't like the bit when the man chopped off the person's arm.
Why not?
Because there was blood.
Oh, but don't we like blood?
No.
And you have to imagine every kid who had a subscription to Starlog, and this was it, a swashbuckling and adventure, better than you could ever imagine to have ever seen type effects. The hype of Star Wars, it's so big that there was a toy released that literally was just the promise of a toy. It's just a piece of cardboard, basically to appease parents to say, yes, we know we couldn't figure out the demand for this in time, so we couldn't have the toys made. So you get to buy a piece of cardboard and you get to give this to your kids on Christmas. Sometime later, you'll get the toys. I mean, that was the hype.
Star Wars figures. R2-D2, Chewbacca, Luke, and Princess Leia. They're the Star Wars Early Bird set of figures. These action figures are not yet available, but this Star Wars Early Bird certificate package is in stores. With this colorful Star Wars picture display stand and certificate, just send in to get a set of figures by mail. They'll be sent to you at home between February 1st and June 1st. The Star Wars Early Bird certificate package, new from Kenner.
And also, I think, again, it might be difficult for people of a younger generation to fully grasp when we talk about the information black hole that there was back then too. When Star Wars was such a huge hit, it wasn't necessarily a given that you're going to get a trilogy or sequels. George Lucas may or may not have been talking about that. He may or may not have been writing with that in mind, but we certainly weren't overly aware of it. Not that you would be now, without the internet, without a lot of mass media to give you the information. It really came out in just like drips and drabs. And I distinctly remember my cousins coming over with either, I don't know if Star Wars Insider was around then, but it was either an issue of that or it might have been Starlog, where they had a location shot from Empire Strikes Back. I don't even think the movie was named at that point, but it's just like Star Wars sequel filming now. And I remember seeing the picture, and it was something depicted on Hoth, so snow, and just, I got goosebumps just seeing that picture, because that's all that you were going to get until maybe the trailer dropped a year, 2 years later. And that's all you had to just hold on to that. And if you didn't have the actual magazine, as I didn't, because my cousins left with it, I had to hold that vision in my head of that image that I saw and be like, so what is this going to entail? Okay, so there's snow. What is this? What does this all mean? And to have to wait for Empire to come out to then see what's the correlation, what's the connection, and in the story that was being told, you just didn't have that information that you do now. Like, you can go into pretty much any movie and have the whole thing spoiled if you want now. I think it's actually kind of hard to go in and not have it spoiled, just if you're perennially online like so many of us are. So just a different world back then, and the hype factor of lines around the corner, because there weren't as many multiplexes. So you'd go to your local theater that maybe they don't only have one movie. If you were lucky, it might be a triplex. Like we had the Lowe's triplex in Stony Brook. That would be show 3, but still, I could remember driving in to see Empire and Return of the Jedi with my parents and pulling into the shopping center, seeing the line literally around the entire shopping mall and be like, well, we're definitely not making it into this one. So we'll come back later and try for the next showing. It's just wild to think about, because you don't have these problems now for the most part. I mean, you might encounter a sold out show, but you can usually find that out from the comfort of your own couch before you head to the theater.
Why are you waiting in such a long line to see a movie?
Well, we've just been looking forward to seeing it. We've waited about a week. We were hoping the lines had kind of diminished, but we just kind of wanted to see it tonight. We're pretty enthusiastic about space program and things along that nature.
Well, I'm a real science fiction fan. I've got hundreds of science fiction books at home, and I think this is going to be a science fiction classic.
The distributors of the family science fiction movie, 20th Century Fox, have been near the top of the New York Stock Exchange during the past week because of Star Wars box office success. If the movie continues to draw the crowds and money it has during these early weeks, the North Park theater manager says Star Wars will go on to break all existing motion picture records.
But I think this is where the impact that Star Wars had on kids that grew up in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't just limited to kids like you and to your cousins. You get all of these filmmakers, producers that see the hype of Star Wars, and then we got to be the beneficiary of other movies, because then in 78, I know you're a big fan of that, you get Battlestar Galactica, gets released, and that blows our minds, especially when the TV series starts, because now you're watching Star Wars on TV. You don't even have to go to the mall and stand in that line. You can watch this on Friday nights on your TV that's about the size of a small Civic. But then Battle Beyond the Stars in 1980, the Roger Corman film, and knowing anything about Corman, of course, he would have jumped at the opportunity of writing the hype of Star Wars to make a Star Wars-like movie, a movie that we've talked about many times that your dad loved, 1980's Flash Gordon. When you look at it in hindsight, I have to think that movie is only greenlit for production because someone says, well, if Star Wars worked, let's kind of do Star Wars, but off-center and do it our way. And Flash Gordon certainly is quirky, and, it's very much its own movie. Metal Storm, like we talked about, the destruction of Jared Sand, and Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, both in 83, that you were able to get in line with and get seats at for both. Ice Pirates in 84, always Space Herpes always has to get a mention. Gremloids Hyperspace, produced by Earl Owensby, that's 84, and that's more like the Spaceballs tone, where it's a bit of a parody. Doesn't always succeed, but Lord Buckethead does make every attempt. And then, like you mentioned, in that group picture, Star Chaser in 85, after Star Wars, after some of these films, before Spaceballs in 87, it's still kind of there in the ether. Folks still want more.
Boom! So there you have it. Your basic intergalactic warfare as the heroic princess is snatched away from the Death Star by the intrepid space buccaneers. And what's the meaning of it all? Who knows and who cares? Star Wars became the new box office champion by providing pure 100% escapist entertainment. It's one of those rare movies that seems to play to every sort of audience, Gene, and bring out the kid in all of us.
I've seen the picture 3 times, and that sequence more than that. And every time I see that little fighting sequence, I think I figured out the secret of at least that chunk of the movie, and that is, that looks exactly like what happens at a pinball game that kids love. We're seeing things blow up, and I think the way this movie is shot different ways, quick action like that, it's like you're putting every person as a pinball player who walks into the theater.
Maybe that's why people can see it a dozen times or 24 times, because it doesn't matter that you know the story. You still have the sound and light, the effects, the explosions, the dogfight in outer space. It's just a never-ending visual delight. I think it's a movie that will last for years.